So it's my pleasure to introduce our second panel today. Starting on the left side of the table, or the left side from my perspective, Chuck Tooley, who is former mayor of Billings, Montana. Next to Chuck is Jenny Eck, who is, I'm going to forget the House District. House District representative from House District 79, Rachel Huff-Doria, who's the executive director of Forward Montana grassroots voter registration organization, Chase Sick, who is the field organizer here in Montana for Turning Point USA, and Dan Zolnikov, who is a representative from House District 45. Sorry, I had that wrong in an earlier version, so I apologize for that. So the first panel today was really focused on the historical and political sort of background of the current dynamics that we see today. We want to begin to shift the conversation a little bit now and start to think about, given those concerns, given those dynamics, how do we move forward? What are the opportunities? What are the avenues? What are the techniques? How do we improve the situation? And so we've invited this group, this distinguished panel, to talk a little bit about their experience. How did they get into politics, whether that's grassroots or legislative or electoral politics? What kinds of experiences have they have, and what do they see in terms of the opportunities and the avenues moving forward? So we're going to begin to shift that conversation, and I am going to turn the floor over to Chuck Tooley to begin those comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. So, I am absolutely delighted not only to be here today to be addressing this subject, but also to be a Montanan and to enjoy this splendid day. I haven't been out too much, but I've been out enough to see how beautiful it is, and reminds me of how much I appreciate what we have here and what we may be able to accomplish together here in Montana. And I'm especially pleased to be part of this group, which is the next generation of leaders. So don't laugh too hard, please, because just because I might be 3 or 4 years older than the average age, it's no reason to poke fun. So I was just thinking about what Chuck Johnson said in the last panel about the way millennials communicate. And it reminded me of something I just saw on Facebook within the past couple of days. It was a post from a very popular DJ in Billings, Montana. And he was talking about the fact that Gary Johnson was asked by a reporter, "What do you think of Aleppo?" And apparently Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate for president, said, "What's Aleppo?" So the DJ repeated that question in his Facebook post. He said, "Just one word, yes or no. If you use more than one word, I'm going to remove your post." How many people know what Aleppo is? And the overwhelming majority were no. And it brings to mind the idea that they have different ways of receiving communication, that they choose different sources for their news. Millennials more than traditional age, like myself. For example, on Thursday, the Billings Gazette had a headline across the page A8 that said, "Many more killed in Aleppo." It was across the entire page. And I'm going to tell him this in a private message when I get around to answering. I'm going to put yes as my remark, and then in private message I'm going to say, it's all a factor of how you get your information, because these headlines, like page A8, have been appearing in the Billings Gazette and other newspapers for years. So anyway, it's not that there's a lack of information as there's different information being received from different sources. Nick Ray said something, and I was just telling Jenny as we were visiting earlier before it started that I was thinking about what I might say today, and as I was sitting listening to these other panelists, the ones that came before, I thought, I've got to make that. So Nick Ray, the risk of having an illegitimate election or an election that's perceived to be illegitimate. I was in Vietnam when President Nguyen Van Thu was running for re-election. He was reelected with 90% of the popular vote. It's blatantly obvious that that was a rigged election, and there were riots in the streets, and the soldiers came in and shot people down. I came through not long afterward. There was still blood running. That's what happens when you think there might be an illegitimate election. I mean, this happened just about the time of the transition to the Third Reich. You know, the illegitimacy of elections. There are several examples, but Nick, I was just talking about what might happen if people think an election is illegitimate. I was, okay, to the subject at hand. I was a Vietnam veteran back from the war and ready to start living life in the real world. How many are Vietnam veterans? A few of you. You remember the real world, in quotes. Vietnam was not the real world. America was the real world. And when I came to Montana in the early 70s, it was a time when Americans were tired of war and tired of corruption in government. Here in Montana, the people had ratified a new constitution. Pat, I was misremembering. Where are you? Is Pat in the room? If not, I was misremembering last night. It was ratified June 6, 1972. But this new constitution protected the environment, protected human rights, and established open and participative government. A little while later, the Democrats nominated and Americans elected a born-again Christian as president. A man who had shared his vision of honest government by and for the people. This seemed to be a time when everything was possible if we worked to make it happen. Now, I didn't start in politics as a candidate. I raised money. I went door to door. I passed out literature. I registered voters. And I also engaged in politics in the larger sense, working for the good of the polis, the Greek term for the people or the city or the state. I served in leadership positions in the community, in community service organizations. I served on the Montana Arts Council. I served in my church locally and regionally. And I helped make good things happen in my community and my state. I was just so happy to be alive and happy to be in America. So after 12 years as an active citizen, I filed and ran for office. Well, I didn't win that first race, but I was a candidate in 8 more elections, and I won 7 of those. I enjoyed my years in elective office. It was not always an easy ride, as my colleagues who are former elected officials and current elected officials know. But we're able to get things done and improve the community. Now I'm going to fast forward to 2013, when a survey of 830 registered voters by public policy voting showed that Congress ranks lower than, brace yourself, lice, colonoscopies, used car salesmen, root canals, and cockroaches. Look it up, public policy polling, 2013. The same poll shows that Congress, thank God, still ranks higher than communism, good, Fidel Castro, meth labs, North Korea, and the Kardashians. So unfortunately, this antipathy toward Congress has spread to state and local political institutions. More and more Americans are turned off about politics, especially those we hope would be our future leaders. Recent surveys have shown that significant percentages of high school, college, and university students loathe politics and politicians and have no interest in becoming a candidate themselves. They still care about community and society and making a difference in the world, but they're doing it in ways other than seeking political office. Well, here's a problem. We have over 500,000 elected offices in America, including state legislators, town and city council, school boards, county commissions, treasurers, sheriffs, district attorneys, justices of the peace, and others. Who's going to run for these offices? I think we've been fortunate in Montana that we are still able to attract good quality candidates, but how long will that last? So, we panelists have been asked to suggest avenues and opportunities to participate in meaningful and productive ways. I would suggest, one, that you find the issues you care about and work together with others to effect the change you seek. I'll give an example in just a moment. Find candidates that you like and trust and admire and help them get elected. Support them with your input and your advice after they're in office also. Third, deliberately, purposefully seek out one or two organizations where most members don't exactly believe the same way you do. Keep going back. And in my case, I joined the Billings Kiwanis Club. And for the first 10 years, I had perfect attendance. There were about 140 men in that club, at that time only men, and Democrats were very rare. But I enjoyed those guys for decades. I came to understand their points of view on issues and appreciated them. We'd sit around, we'd have lunch, we'd joke, we'd talk about business, we'd talk about politics, all kinds of things. I appreciated them, even if I didn't agree all the time. So, number 4, there's something that I inserted here after listening to Dan Kemmis make a remark. I don't see him right. Oh, there's Dan. Okay. He mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville. The can-do energy, the can-do spirit of Americans. And so we tapped into that in Billings a few years ago. We had done something as a community to fight violence and to fight hate. And because of the positive results of that effort, we came to feel very good about ourselves as a community. And leadership in the community identified that as something we could leverage to make ourselves better. We identified a project, urban revitalization, and specifically the renewal of downtown Billings. And what we did was a 1.5-year process to engage the entire community in surveys, in focus groups, in presentations. We involved over 1,000 citizens to get their input on what does urban revitalization look like, and specifically, what does downtown revitalization look like? We were focusing on something specific that we could identify, not some nebulous concept, and we put together a plan. It was released in 1997, and step by step by step, we made that plan happen. And within 10 years, we had brought in over 100 new businesses to downtown Billings. We had leveraged, for every dollar of public money, we leveraged over $6 of private investment. We revitalized downtown, new streetscapes. We put in new buildings, hospitals, a new bank, new government buildings in 12 years after that plan was released. We put in a fantastic new library for about $14 million. We put in the number one minor league baseball park in America, I'll have you know, $14 million. We put that in. Over $250 million of investment because we engaged everybody. We wanted everyone's opinion. And we made sure there was a process to let people participate. So, that was something I just credit Dan Kimmis for reminding me of. Thank you, Dan. As Americans, as human beings, there are many things that we all care about. Think with me what they are. Their health, our safety, the safety of our families, our children and their education, the love of family and friends, the opportunity to succeed in our jobs and our businesses, the opportunity to follow our dreams. Everyone you talk to has similar motivations. So start with that understanding in any interaction you have. These are fellow humans and they deserve respect. If I had to give one piece of advice about how we move forward from here, I'll give you one word. Listen. Listen respectfully and sincerely. Listen for meaning, not to contrive an argument against what was just said. Listen without interrupting or arguing. Keep listening and understanding and processing and listen some more. And at some point, don't rush it. Your opinion will be solicited at some point. And when it is, you have a better chance of being listened to yourself. So, to leave on a positive note, I spoke a few years back at the senior symposium at a college in Virginia, and I thought I'd try something I'd never done before. I shared with them the Athenian Code. Now, this was a pledge that the young men of Athens took as they were embarking on full citizenship as adults. The Athenian Code. And I read this out loud to them. There were about senior symposium, maybe 300 or so people in the room. I talked about what it meant. And I said, do you think that you could commit to something like this, if not for your city, if you don't come from a city, maybe for your community or your campus or your state? And I saw so many heads nod that I took a chance. It's a powerful moment, wasn't it, Joni? My wife was there. And I said, please stand and raise your right hand and repeat after me. We will never bring disgrace on this city by an act of dishonesty or cowardice. We will fight for the ideals and sacred things of this city, both alone and with many. We will revere and obey the city's laws and will do our best to incite a like reverence and respect in those above us who are prone to annul them or set them at naught. We will strive increasingly to quicken the public's sense of civic duty. Thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this city not only not less, but greater. and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. 300 willingly took that oath. There's all sorts of hope for our future. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Great to see you here on a Saturday in September. It's beautiful outside, and yet we're here having this very important conversation about the future of our state and our country. My name is Jenny Eck. I represent the west side of Helena, and I serve in the legislature. I'm running for my third term in the House, and this time running unopposed, which is a nice change of pace. But I decided to instead take on running the Clinton presidential campaign because, gosh knows, I mean, why would you want to enjoy summer in Montana? Wouldn't it be better to be holed up in an office 12 hours a day making phone calls, which is what I've opted to do. But in all seriousness, I love being engaged in politics. It's been a great honor, and I'm learning every day more about myself and more about my community. I grew up in a family that talked about politics around the dinner table all the time. We talked about current events all the time, so it wasn't a big surprise for my folks when I ended up majoring in government in college, although I never thought I'd use it. I just kind of took a bunch of classes, decided I liked government best, and those credits added up, and before I knew it, I was majoring in government, and I really didn't think that it would go any further than that. After college, I had a couple of kids with my husband and ended up staying home with them, and I really wasn't sure where we were gonna land. We came to Montana so he could go to law school, moved to Helena so he could clerk at the Supreme Court, and I was home taking care of the kids and working part-time at a preschool when the Obama campaign came to Montana and opened a field office in Helena. And they were looking for a volunteer coordinator. I was very passionate about Obama's campaign, and I signed up, and miraculously they took me on. And so for that primary, I worked on the campaign. And it was my first spark of the excitement of campaigning and really putting your values into motion through grassroots organizing. And I'll have to say that since then, I have met so many people of my generation who got engaged in politics through that campaign. That campaign was really, in that year, that cycle was really a seminal change in engaging the next generation of organizers across the country. I went on to work briefly for the Democratic Party as a staffer, and then in 2009, I was hired as the Judiciary Committee Secretary for the House Judiciary Committee. And it was really an interesting experience because for 4 months, I had to be a nonpartisan, silent observer of the process. I couldn't state an opinion, I couldn't speak. And through that process, I mean, for those of you who watch the legislature, the Judiciary Committee is extremely polarized a lot of the time, talking about very difficult issues, immigration, guns, abortion. I mean, some of the hardest issues to discuss. But what I noticed over the course of those 4 months were there were so many moments where I wished I could say something, that I had an opinion and I didn't hear anyone else saying it. And I came out of that session realizing that maybe my perspective of being a mom with kids from a working middle-class family with bills to pay every day, that maybe that was a relevant perspective that needed to be up there. And so it just sort of opened the crack in my mind about, someday maybe I'll do this. Fast forward 3 years, I worked for the Attorney General's office, worked in consumer protection, kind of got more comfortable with public speaking in that role, got a little comfortable with talking to the press. And Mike Menahan, who was holding my seat, decided to leave and run for judge instead. And suddenly there was this open seat in Helena, and I decided to throw my name in the hat. I ran in a 3-way primary, so I started campaigning 14 months out from the November election date, then had a tough general race, and then was elected in 2012. And I go through all of that to say that Montana has a true citizen legislature. The fact that someone like me, who had very limited political background, was not from a political family in terms of people who had served in elected office, is not from money, was able to access the system and become a part of the system and change the system by bringing my perspective into the process. I think the thing that's amazing about Montana is that we really do have access to our leaders, whether it's our US senators or our local senators or our mayors. They're all very accessible to us. And as legislators, as elected officials, we have access to our constituents. I knocked thousands of doors when I ran for those 14 months, and I talked to people from all walks of life, from all different communities in my district. And it was a very humbling and empowering and inspiring experience. I would say the greatest antidote to cynicism is to get out and talk to people in your community. One anecdote that stays with me, I found that Friday nights were actually a great time to meet people. A lot of times they were home on Friday nights when it'd be hard to find them at home other nights of the week. And there was a night when I was just wrapping up. It was 8 o'clock on a chilly October night, getting close to the election, and I was talking to a man who had just come home from his second job for the day. He was working his second shift for the day. And we were just standing out talking in his yard under the stars. It was just a very crisp, clear night. And he was just talking to me about how he had served in Iraq, how he'd come home and had been struggling ever since. His family had been struggling ever since. He couldn't hang on to a job. And yet, he just had to keep going. He had no choice but to keep going. He didn't know what next month was going to bring, but he had kids to feed and a family to support. And it was just, and that moment, I guess the point of that for me was, it didn't matter what his politics were, and it didn't matter what my politics were. We were just two people standing under the Montana sky talking about life and just the very real challenges that we all face, and we each face in our own way. So I think that gives me a lot of hope. When I get up to the legislature, I try to remember that everyone that I serve with, we're actually very similar more than we're different. We're a rare breed of policy wonks who have chosen to give up 4 months of our lives every other year to do this really difficult work, to leave our families, to leave our jobs. And so I think that's a really good place to start from. And I know that can sound Pollyanna-ish, but I really mean it. I think when we're talking about, how can we move forward, we need to be a little bit philosophical about this, and I think we need to dig deep and look into each of our own selves as to how we're going to be part of the solution. At being an elected official, I'm obviously very used to, being attacked and told that I'm the problem, or hearing the narrative of, all politicians are terrible and we're corrupt and we're ineffectual, and that's a very popular narrative right now, and there's certainly it's deserved in part, but I think we have to recognize that we are all the ones that we're waiting for. To quote Obama, we are the ones we've been waiting for. We each have a responsibility to engage in the process in the best way that we can, however that looks. And so I try to go by a few rules of thumb when I'm at the legislature and when I'm engaging with others, wherever I'm going. And sometimes I'm more successful than others. But one is to resist the urge to be self-righteous. And that's, self-righteousness is it's like a drug. It feels amazing to stand up and pound your fist on the table and be self-righteous. Because it's, there's that contrast of I'm right and you are wrong, and that feels really good. And I think that, that's a problem that we have not just among electeds, but among the electorate, this self-righteous thing that we do, where we stand in our opposite corners and we throw rocks at each other, and that really gives us an excuse to not engage. The second is, I would say, don't assume others' motives. And this is something that I try to keep in mind when I'm working with people across the aisle, especially because, generally speaking, people's motives are sincere and good. I think being at the legislature, it's especially clear because there's nobody up there getting rich or getting powerful, I can tell you that. So why are we there? We're there because we genuinely want to make a difference. And if I can come at that with another legislator and approach an issue with that understanding at the beginning, it's amazing how much we can get accomplished. I would say, I mentioned being cynical and resisting the urge to be cynical is my third, and that kind of ties in with self-righteousness. But cynicism is certainly the mode of the day, whether you're, turning on the TV or talking to the people that are in your own little political world. it's something that has become a way for us to avoid, I think, really grappling with issues. I think it's a way to step back and protect ourselves, and I think we've got to lean in. And that leads me to my fourth point, which is we need to get proximate to what we don't understand and get proximate to what scares us. And that means rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in in making change happen, and getting close to it. I've been reading a book that if you haven't read, I would recommend putting it at the top of your list. It's called Just Mercy, and it's by Brian Stevenson. He's an attorney who went down to Alabama and started an organization where he works to help prisoners who are on death row. And it's just a phenomenal book in many ways, but he talks about the work that he does and why he stays in it. And he says, I don't do what I do because it's required or necessary or important. I don't do it because I have no choice. I do what I do because I'm broken too. My years of struggling against inequality, abusive power, poverty, oppression, and injustice had finally revealed something to me about myself. Being close to suffering, death, in his case, executions and cruel punishments, didn't just illuminate the brokenness of others. In a moment of anguish and heartbreak, it also exposed my own brokenness. You can't effectively fight abusive power, poverty, inequality, illness, oppression, or injustice and not be broken by it. We are all broken by something. We have all hurt someone and have been hurt. We all share the condition of brokenness, even if our brokenness is not equivalent. And then he goes on to say, we have a choice. We can embrace our humanness, which means embracing our broken natures and the compassion that remains our best hope for healing, or we can deny our brokenness, forswear compassion, and as a result, deny our own humanity. And I've been ruminating on that a lot. I think that there's a lot that we can take from that in anything that we do, and certainly in the work of governance. And I think that's an important thing to think about. I'll just also wanted to make a point about something that was referenced earlier, which is, I hear a lot of this looking back and sort of glorifying the days of when people got together in government. And obviously I wasn't serving at that time, so I can take folks' words for it, but I would point out, just to be the devil's advocate, that many of the outcomes from these better functioning governments were not good for a vast percentage of the country's population. Something else that gives me hope about where we're headed is that our state houses and our federal houses are more diverse than ever before in our history. And I think that's important. I think that matters, and I think it's something we should celebrate. Montana now has the largest percentage of women serving in the legislature than ever before. I think that makes a big difference in the policies that we're passing. Also, we have a record number of Native American candidates running, and if many of those are successful, we may have a record number of Native Americans serving the legislature. And I've often said, and I'll say again, that I think, democracy is only as effective as, does the leadership reflect the larger body of people? And if that's not the case, if the legislature only looks like a sliver of the population, we're going to have problems. So I sincerely believe that we are going through growing pains that are hard but necessary, and that in the long run, we will work our way through this to a better place. And this last session gave me a lot of hope for that. We passed some major pieces of legislation in a bipartisan spirit: Medicaid expansion, vast and sweeping changes on mental health and abilities to address mental health crises in our communities. We passed the Disclose Act to bring more transparency to our campaign finance, and that is critical, I think, also to moving forward with effective and fair government. So there's a lot to celebrate and to be optimistic about. There's always room for improvement, but I for one, am mostly feeling positive.
Hello. My name is Rachel, and I'm the executive director at Forward Montana, and we educate and engage young people to shape their democracy. And I was asked just to share a little bit about how I first got involved in politics. And so, unlike Bob Brown, politics was not my primary interest since I was a child. The way I actually came to politics was from a story of voter suppression. And so I was a student at Marshall University. That's in West Virginia. It's kind of in the core of Appalachia, pretty close to Kentucky, Ohio. You might be more familiar with it because there was a football rivalry with the University of Montana back in the 90s. So I think we won that one. I'm sorry. And during that time, I was actually involved in the Students for Barack Obama group. So interesting that Jenny brought that up. But it was the first moment I really felt engaged and excited about politics, really in my entire life. And I was drawn to the message of equality, racial equality, gender equality, equality in healthcare. And that was the opportunity for me to connect. And so I was a part of this group, and we organized voter registration drives. We went door to door in our community in West Virginia. We marched in parades. And I also played soccer at my university, and so I also got the athletic groups involved. And that all ended when it was time to vote. And we had been told that we would be allowed to use our campus identification when we went to the polls. And so I loaded up my Honda Fit, and I put a whole bunch of students in there, and we all trekked down to the polling location. And then there was a problem. We got there, and no one was letting us vote. And so to look around and to see those faces of disappointment, first-time voters who were there to participate, who had thought very hard about why they were choosing to engage, to be barred from voting. And so a couple of phone calls later, and after a little bit of arguing and deliberation, we were allowed to vote. But that's a moment in my life that I won't forget, those faces of my peers who were disappointed, and the resolve that it provided me to never let anyone stop me from participating. So fast forward a few years, I worked in West Virginia in reproductive justice. We passed some really great bipartisan measures on fair treatment for pregnant workers and maternity coverage for dependent daughters. Really excited and proud of that work. And then I moved to Montana to work with Forward Montana, and we educate and engage young people to shape their democracy to reflect their needs and values. So there's a couple of keys to our programs I'll speak briefly about. And one of those is that you have to invite a young person to participate. Some people, I think, make the assumption that voting is there. You can just go, register, vote. But for us, one of our key pieces of work is registering young voters, having that one-on-one conversation, peer-to-peer, about why voting is important, why they should get involved in their local, state, nationwide elections. And then also, the second piece of the program is to make politics approachable and more easy to understand. And so ballots are pretty long and confusing. There's often not a lot of information about candidates. Even at the presidential level, we hear all of the time about Hillary and Trump. But what do you actually know about their issue standpoints? Probably not a lot if you're only listening to bits of video that are replayed on social media. Probably not a lot if you're listening to any of the mainstream media sources. And so take that down to a smaller level, and we're talking about county commission, public service commission, Office of Public Instruction. How do we provide information to people in general in something they can digest and understand? The Missoula County Elections Office did a survey, I think it was last year, somewhat recently, that the number one reason people choose to sit out of participating in elections is because there's not enough of unbiased information provided about candidates. And so that's one of the reasons Forward Montana does a voter guide. It's very straightforward. It includes yes or no yes or no questions and answers, because we think people need to have that information to align their values with whichever candidates they choose. The third thing that Forward Montana does that I think is really essential in involving and bringing young people to the table is making voting and civic engagement a part of their culture. And so voting is a habit. If you do not vote when you are younger, those first years where you're actually allowed to vote, you are far less likely to begin voting at the age of 45 or 55 or even 65. So by talking to young people even before they're allowed to be voting, we work in high schools, 16, 17, 18-year-olds in our Underage Democracy Project, talking to them about why voting is important, how they can register to vote when they're 18, and it becomes a part of their culture. Peer-to-peer interaction is the way we do that. And so as much as, people want to talk about millennials and social media and the internet and everything like that, I think that's great, and that can be a great communication tool. But where it really comes down to is building those relationships and making sure you're having that peer-to-peer communication. And so those are just a couple of keys to our program, but I look forward to questions and discussion a little bit later. Thank you.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Chase Sick. I'm the Montana Field Director for Forward Montana. We're a nonprofit that's similar, Forward Montana, Turning Point USA. We're similar to Forward Montana. Very different perspectives. I was born in Iowa on Election Day, and I've always kind of wondered if I found politics or if the political sphere kind of found me along the way. Pretty apathetic early on. I think the extent of my political involvement was I used to move political signs when they'd get in the way during harvest season. And today, kind of fast forwarding, I went to Bozeman. I love it out here. Studied political science with some great instructors like Linda Young and Eric Austin. And it was about that time that David Parker, an instructor in Bozeman, introduced me to David Herbst, who was doing the local Steve Dane's office, and that was my first paid internship. And he won that one, so I always thought, it's going to be easy. We'll be able to win more in the future. And subsequently, I worked for Matt Rosendale and the Hawaii Republican Party, and it was about that time I realized it's not quite that easy every election. And so it was about that time I went back and I finished my master's in public administration in Bozeman. This is a really rewarding program. And I also became involved with Turning Point USA, who hired me on as the Montana Field Director. And so we travel across all of Montana's campuses. We try and get young people engaged and involved, registered to vote. And regardless of their political persuasions, I think what has been the most rewarding about my job so far is just being able to listen to young people and hear their voice and hear that we're not easily hoodwinked by everything we hear. There's been some really good, I'd say, groups and experiences that have happened through social media. We've been able to utilize that, but like Forward Montana, it's the peer-to-peer interactions that are really the most important. So, yeah, with that, I hope to perhaps run in Montana someday. I'll be able to represent the state I love as maybe a citizen legislator. But for now, I'm really happy with what I do. So thank you.
Thank you, Chase.
How you doing? This is exciting. My name is Daniel Zolnikov. I'm a state representative running for my third term out of the Billings area. And I do like to always put Billings, not just the area, because you think you're completely, what they talked about earlier was correct. We tend to think of our districts, not the entire city, and that can kind of get us off the main point sometime. I learned my first session, actually quickly afterwards, that there's two ways to become an expert in a field. The first way is to spend 10,000 hours studying it. The second way is to be the first person to run across it. And I definitely was the second way in what I've kind of become more of a leader on in some areas, and that's more technology, legislation, and privacy. It did save me some time, though, so that's why I'm able to speak in front of you at 29 instead of a few years later with a little bit more expertise. So if one word described me, it would be untraditional. Almost everything about me is untraditional. My family's first-generation Americans. I graduated from Roundup High School. My lifestyle is a minimalist. I'm a very conservative, liberty-minded conservative who Ron Paul was my motivation to get involved in politics. I'm not religious. I mean, last week, literally, I got this urge to sign up for some college courses at MSUB, and so I signed up for some morning courses at MSUB. I signed up to also drive occasionally for Uber. I would donate the money because I helped pass that law last session. But I did that so I could actually see the effects and if it had an impact on people's lives, and also to try to make it cool. Everything I do seems to not be the norm, but it's so enjoyable and so freeing. So as my libertarian self, kind of my lifestyle, I just kind of keep going that route. Even that also is involved in my politics too. I probably committed political suicide, or what people would call political suicide, numerous times. I've done things you should not have done. I've confronted people I should not have confronted. And somehow I am still here. I still have an election to win. So we'll see in November. But apparently it's something that needs to be done. And at the time of Trump, we're in a time when different isn't bad. I ran in 2012, the time when cockroaches were more interesting than politics. I was running at 24 years old. And people, including my mother, were like, well, are you going to be experienced enough? I started knocking on doors, and when ladies came out and hugged me because I was not them, I thought that I had a pretty good chance of winning. It's interesting, though, because over the years I've knocked on doors, and I've gotten people say, well, you guys are the problem, and you are what's wrong in politics. And I said, why? Because I was the one mad enough to actually run, and I was the one who bothered and thought that it was such a the system didn't work for people so well that I thought that, why wouldn't I be able to do better? The bar was low. We'll just admit it. And so sometimes that's the best place to start. The other interesting thing on knocking on doors is I learned something kind of about people. Obviously, this has definitely changed my perspective on life the last few years in politics, but I took my time on the doors. I listened to people. I would have half-an-hour conversations. I would hit 10 doors in a night. I knocked on doors nonstop. I did 24 days in a row. I had doors where people were like, Friday night, what are you doing, man? Like, go out and do something. I'm like, I didn't even know it was Friday night because I'm going to do this tomorrow, and Saturdays and Sundays are the worst days because that's like a 10-hour day versus just a 4-hour evening. So it was a very interesting thing, but I took my time with people. I would have half-hour conversations, sit there, and we would go until they were done. They're like, oh, we don't want to take your time. We don't want to waste your time. I said, no, let's talk. I'm here. You're here. And then at the end of it, people would start just releasing, and it was just this political tension that had grown over years and not being heard, not being listened to, and that was amazing. So let me move forward. In the legislature, I definitely did, like I said, focused on technology policy. I have an information systems background, a marketing background, a management. I have 3 majors from a college. A lot of it's technology focused. It's a new age, and that's kind of where I think things are heading. And that wasn't all that I did. Most of my legislation, especially the last few terms, had been ACLU supported, which is very interesting from my political background. I co-sponsored legislation that would remove the ability to take licenses away from students who didn't pay their student debt. I was a co-sponsor on asset forfeiture, where the Democrat was the main person, but it reformed asset forfeiture so your property couldn't be taken without you being charged and found guilty of a crime. I did a freedom of the press bill. I did a bill that would allow minors under 21 to not get MIPs if they called 911 to ensure safety. I did email tech legislation this one didn't pass, to get warrants to make sure you could not read people's emails until you got a warrant, just to make sure there's a balance of power. Uber, I'm right now I said I would work on medical marijuana legislation, net metering legislation. I even supported crazy concepts like abolishing the death penalty and getting rid of the gay marriage concept in our Constitution. One of 2 Republicans, the only one running for re-election. A little bit different. And so people would think, okay, so this guy's pretty moderate. I'm one of the 4% of legislators in the country who has a 100% rating from CPAC, the conservative score. I am extremely conservative on my voting record. And yet I can do these crazy things like I just mentioned earlier, which would say, well, this guy sounds more in the middle. I've spoken with the ACLU to the Tea Party, where I heard then the national Tea Party groups were talking to each other about this crazy idea of, whoa, we might have some things in common. I spoke at UCLA, University of Texas, MSUB. Sadly, my alma mater, University of Montana, has never invited me to speak there. Libertarian parties, Montpurg. I spoke at DEF CON, the largest hacking convention in the world. On the Penn and Teller, the comedians in Vegas, I spoke on their stage. I've done things with different groups very untraditionally. Yet again, I have this 100% conservative score because I have really, I've done what I think was right. The difference was I tried to get past what I thought was right to understand where other people were coming from as well and not make it as personal. Now, politics is hard when you get a mailer like I have during my primary election saying, oh, well, this guy is inhibiting catching terrorists or child pornographers or anything. Some of these mailers can be pretty nasty. So you really have to get past, as Jenny said, your self-righteous mentality of disliking people. When you're getting hit over and over and over again, and your friends and your peers and your parents and siblings see it, that's hard. That is hard to not want to turn around and dislike or even despise someone. So that is, as you said, and as the earlier panel mentioned, I keep looking at Bob, but Bob, you're in the center, so you're just like my guy I got to look at. I'm not talking at you. I'm not trying to teach you anything here. When there is a lot more of those attacks going on, it is a lot easier to go talk with your friends who also got attacked, get in your bipartisan mentality, and or not your groupthink mentality, stick with your friends and talk about your battle wounds. It is very hard to get hit and then walk up and shake the person who has hit you. So we are definitely in that world. And like I said, my politics are very interesting. Even with that very conservative score, I recently this summer endorsed Gary Johnson for president. I do not believe in those types, or I try very hard to not be in a disrupted, negative political world where everybody is filled with hateful rhetoric. I don't like who's running right now on either side. I think it's very disruptive, and I think it's a bad example for this country. I endorsed honestly, he's a moderate Republican running as a libertarian, which is that is not what I expected would occur, even out of the Libertarian Party, but I did it because I thought that was maybe the best route to go, that there are always another option. Your vote is not a wasteful thing. It is not a calculation. It's a very important thing that is yours to do with what you want. So my philosophy with this is that I am within a political party in Montana. Now, I could point the finger at the other party, and I could always say, you guys are wrong, you guys are bad, fix this, you should change that. Well, that's not my job to do that. My job is to fix my own party, I believe. There have been times when I've called out members of my own party, and I do not regret that, because sometimes we need to keep ourselves more accountable. But to do that, we have to accept that we have faults as a party, as individuals, and that we are not perfect and that we can change. That is why I've always looked internally. That is why sometimes I get a lot of pushback internally as well. So I ran for office again, and I wanted to prove something else as well, that I could take, again, solid stances, stick with my guns, and still recognize commonalities. The issues I've taken up are more enjoyable because they aren't the middle-of-the-road players of the game. I have the far right and the far left, and we get to sit in a room together and come around over on this side and talk about the things that we have in common. And you know what? It's a lot of fun because some of those people do not like each other at all. And they honestly, there's a lot of, they despise each other sometimes. So when you get them there to recognize it, it's almost like they don't know what to do. And I'm talking about people twice my age. It's like they're stuttering. They don't trust the other person, and they both don't trust each other. And yet it's like, you guys have this one thing in common that we can work on. So how do we improve this political climate when we have these fringes over here and fringes over here? Again, I think we have to question our internal politics. We do have to get to know the other side of the aisle and make friends on that other side of the aisle. If we, again, point and they're the enemy and we're the saints, then there's not going to be any personal growth. We're not going to change. We're not going to develop. We're not going to steer in a positive direction. If we try to better where we're at and we try to at least get to know where the other group's coming from, there will always be commonalities. All of us have a lot in common, and we have a lot that's very different from each other. Now, if we will focus on how different we are from each other, we will leave this room in a very negative manner. If we do find a few things in common, we could all literally be friends by the time we left this place. What one do you want? I definitely like being in a happy, positive environment, so I'd rather be friends with most of you. Plus, maybe less negative op-eds will be written one day. So I'll finish this. Last night, I had a beer with some, more environmental lobbyists and Democrat staffers, and also with a more traditional lobbyist or more conservative lobbyist, and that was my politics. During the session, I lived downtown last time, and I always went to the Democrat bar. I had a great time. First off, Democrats tend to be younger, and second off, sometimes they tend to be funner. So I hung out with them, and it was really helpful. By having this mentality, you get along with them. Even in this recent interim committee I served on, there was a Democrat from Missoula. I know, Republican from Billings, Democrat from Missoula. And I liked the guy. I trust the guy. He didn't point fingers. He was probably one of the most respectful guys I've ever met. He said, you know what? First session, let's focus on this emergency 911 legislation. Least sexy political issue out there. I will tell you that. You know, who wants to jump on an issue that is not that interesting to make sure the technology matches across the state so when you call 911, they can identify you? No one even knows that issue. You all have blank stares. Exactly. That uninteresting. So what did I do? First session, okay, this is a lot of money. There's a lot of fights. No. Second session, we kind of heard about it, but not much. We're sitting in this committee. I'm like, I'll say representative so I don't identify the guy. I'm like, what? I was like, you know what? You're passionate about it. I trust where you're coming from. Let's do it. So we, that day, put out a bill draft and got all these players together. And all of a sudden, we had 20, and then the next year and a half, 25 people came into the room. They put together a massive bill that everybody agreed on. We found a $10 million pot to fix the issue. And the best part about it is we just formed it. The legislators took a step back, and a consensus was formed with players that literally to get them to all agree was nearly impossible. The only reason this occurred was because there was a commonality, or it wasn't commonality. The philosophy was completely different, but there was respect in the room. And when he mentioned something, I listened to him. That was more important than even compromising or anything. There was no compromise. This is an issue we can fix and get out of the way. So instead of talking the talk, I really do believe we need to walk the walk. And I know someone mentioned the press earlier, and even the press basically back in the day had standards where you don't talk about personal life and family. And now those are some of the most clicked upon articles. So right now, we as politicians, press, members of the community, individuals, we have the freedom of speech to say basically what we want, but it is our job to use it appropriately and hold ourselves accountable. So thank you.
So I know we're getting close to lunch, but I do want to take at least a couple minutes here to take a few questions for this panel. So we'll spend about the next 5 minutes or so, take a few questions, and then give you a chance to stretch your legs. As you can see, we got serving sets out. We've got lunch coming quickly, but questions and answers before that.
Hi, not a question, just a comment really directed at Rachel. In 1995, the University of Montana Grizzlies beat Marshall 22-20 to win the national championship. But in 1996, the injured Randy Moss came back, played for Marshall, and we lost 49-29.
The 90s, I was pretty young, so.
All right, so just as a millennial, it's not really a question. I just wanted to thank you guys for getting my generation involved in politics, because I adore politics. I think it's really cool. I think government is really cool. I'm currently majoring in political science with a concentration in public law. I intend to be an attorney. So I just wanted to thank you guys for all of the work you do for my generation and getting us involved, because I think it's really, really important that we do. So thanks.
I've noticed that it seems like the political parties, both of them, has a smaller percentage of people that identify with their parties. And it seems like the independence is growing. I'm not sure if that's true. But I'm wondering if the parties themselves are looking at this and are talking about, why do people not want to identify as Democrats or identify as Republicans? And if you think that there's anything that can be done within those party structures to turn this around so they get more people willing to identify with a particular party.
I'd answer that if that's okay. I believe that political parties, as you may know, are becoming more polarized, and it is okay to have your principles, and I completely believe in that, like I said, but also you got to look externally and see what the average population is doing. So internally, I don't think the political parties are appealing to independents. I think they're trying to appeal more and more to their base, which is why the independent amount is growing, which is why you have to listen to them. I'll just keep it really short, but I surround most of my friends. Some of them have really rough backgrounds. Some of them, are from Roundup, so I got that too. A lot of them are not political. They're very independent, so they help me understand how the average person thinks. When you talk to people politically, there's too much groupthink. There's too much they can find alternative media that will fit their views versus really challenging what the normal person thinks. So no, I don't think they're looking at that. Maybe it's negative.
And if I can, I'm not sure if, this is on, right? Okay. And if I can just piggyback to the millennial generation, more so than any other generation, identifies increasingly as independent. I believe 50% of young people now identify as independent, as not with a political party. I think it does leave us with some serious questions, because we are in a two-party system then. If young people are not participating in the political party systems, what true power are they holding when creating different platforms?
I have another question regarding the millennials. When many of us were younger and kids, the news media was fairly consolidated. So you had, papers, and you had TV stations that centralized ideas about the news. And I have two sons, two daughters, and they find most of their news on the internet. And a couple of them are millennials. And one of the things that I've noticed is that in the internet, you have clusters of simulthink, where you can get news, and it seems like you can get whatever exactly you believe in a particular news media on the internet, and then you just stay focused in on that. And it leads towards myopia. And yet, the youth are also very inquisitive and kind of skeptical about politics. I just wonder what you think the impact of that decentralization of media, how that's impacting, sort of the body politic.
Well, I would say I don't think it's just the internet. I mean, we're seeing that on television as well, cable TV, everyone kind of retreating to their own comfort spaces as far as what they believe. But so I don't think it's, I mean, from my perspective, it's not just a millennial issue, I guess. From my perspective, this is an issue that crosses generational divides, and it's something that we need to grapple with, and that we need to, make up our own minds about how we're going to come back together and find ways to talk to each other. I mean, I've noticed in this presidential cycle, I hear over and over and over again from people who say they can't talk to someone else about the presidential race at all, within their family, with their neighbors, with their friends, that that's just a place that people can't even go, which I completely relate to. It's very, very difficult. But if we can't even have those conversations, how are we ever going to come together and figure our way forward? So I think we all have to, find the courage to start having those conversations, to start talking about what we're reading and what we're watching, and to, try to find other sources of news. And I don't think that's just incumbent upon the millennials. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do that. But certainly as parents, raising the next generation, trying to explain things in a more holistic way and not fall back on tropes is probably important too. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Rachel, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. And when we see there's almost an overload of information, right? There's too much information. It's just advertisings and news everywhere, that I think finding trusted sources is important. And so I think a lot of people will end up finding trusted brands, whether it's media or an individual blogger or an individual group or whatever that might be. That could be a part of the answer, or an individual person that they speak with. But I think, like Jenny was saying too, as much as we want to talk about our similarities, I think it's important that we're able to talk about our differences and communicate about those, because that's why we vote, right? It's because we don't all agree on every issue.
And kind of piggybacking on her idea there, if I could have one conversation with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, I would say, can we break up the algorithms so we don't have these echo chambers where everybody sees, kind of confirmation bias every time? Sort of a more fair, unbiased Facebook page would be a start.
All right, let's go ahead and let's give these guys one more round of applause. Thank you so much for your interest, your expertise. Food will be coming out here in the next couple of minutes. Take a moment or two to stretch your legs, refill your water glasses. Lunch will be on your tables, and we'll move to our lunchtime keynote here in a little bit.